Hey guys, today I'm going to be talking about defensive strategy. A few of the different strategy types you have, what my personal recommendations for defensive strategy are, and some pros and cons of all of these. So, the first and most popular form of going for defenders is, of course, going for two ways. Now, well, two ways can be an extremely effective way of going for defenders because they let you still use attacking options, of course. They definitely have their downside where, um, if you're going for two ways, a lot of the two ways are not going to be as potent on either defense or attack. There are exceptions, of course, and there are ones that have really interesting ways to be used as two ways, but generally, I think it's overall better to be drafting your defenders or drafting your attackers specifically for a purpose. And then there are some two ways that I want to talk about real quick that have an interesting way to use them as two ways. So with this is defenders that, they're generally strong on defense, but then they're going to have an Achilles heel or two. And then these type of defenders can still be decent for BGs, even though, they're going to get absolutely destroyed by the nuke options, because you can then go and use these defenders on attack and mess with that drafting. A perfect example for this is Rintrah. So Rintrah is one of the best defenders, but if they get Ghost, Rintrah can be taken in like 20 seconds with Ghost. So this is a perfect example. So instead of just then having to use Rintrah on defense, you can use Rintrah as a nuke, and he's going to be extremely effective. This is a bit of an extreme example, with Rintrah being one of the strongest attackers and defenders in general, and then having that one Achilles heel. But it applies to a whole lot of champions. Hyperion, Cersei, Moleman, Kingpin are some of the other best examples in general, but you have a lot of two ways that can be used this type. I'm not going to list off every single one. I'm sure you guys are going to be able to find for your deck who the options are that fit this bill. Like for my own deck, I use Rintrah, and I use Ibomb and Moleman, and Killmonger and Toad this way to an extent. And it's a very effective way of combining in the good benefits that you get with a two-way strategy, without having as many of the negatives that come with two ways of a lot of delving into two ways, generally leaving you weaker on both ends. I do think it's important to keep a mix of everything for your defensive strategy. And for two ways, this is the main way I would recommend going for two ways, and there is another extremely effective way that kind of is the opposite. I'll delve into it further on attacking strategy, which will be the next video after this. But for the basic concept of the other way to go about two ways is using nukes like an Omega Red, who is, mainly a nuke. He's almost always drafted as a nuke, but then you go for you draft like 5 nukes. You can't place all defenders. So then you have to place one of your attackers on defense in a situation like this. Having the attackers like Omega Red, what's another good example? Like a Hulkling, like a High-Sig Guardian, like a Nimrod, like a Moleman, like an Ibomb, like a Human Torch, even with his torch trapping. Having these attackers like this that can then be placed on defense, if you get into a scenario where it's necessary, is another good way of going about two ways, where it just lets you draft like 5 nukes, and you don't have to worry about not having a good defender, because you're going to be able to still out-nuke the opponent even with placing one of your nukes on defense. And I've been doing that a lot, and it's a very effective way of going about two ways. Again, I would not recommend going too heavily into two ways. I've seen a lot of decks where, it just goes extremely heavy on two ways, and then you don't have quite as strong of a deck due to, due to just going too focused in on only having two ways and stuff like that. In general, I think you want to put some of it, but you don't want to have just a whole lot of two ways, and you don't want two ways in your deck just for the sake of them being two ways. But if they fill one of these two bills, they can be an extremely effective two-way for your deck. the other main two strategies for defense are, one, outdrafting, trying to outdraft your opponent, and just hoping they don't get a counter to your defenders. You've got certain ones like I-Bomb, like Man-Thing, like Toad, like Hulkling, and these are the ones that generally fill the spill, where they're pretty awful defenders if you actually get the good counters to them, but they can be extremely potent. Killmonger, another one, just he fits the spill too well, so I have to mention it. But yeah, these types, they're not reliable defenders. They're generally going to do quite poor, but they can single-handedly win you rounds from using them, to outdraft your opponent and just them not getting a counter to them. And it's an extremely effective way to win some rounds. They're not going to be good stallers in general, but using that in your deck can be very effective on occasion. And now we get into stallers. So, stallers, the final topic, this is the most kind of vague one, since stallers are relative to how good your attack is. You don't need a staller to be an extremely long fight for the opponent. What you need from a staller is for it to be long enough for you to be able to win. And that's a little bit vague. A lot of champions can be stallers if your attack is good enough. But in general, some of the best stallers are APOC, Korg, Kingpin, Moleman, Nick Fury, and Rintrah, and Thing, and then Havoc with an equity, and Terex with an equity, and Null with an equity. These tend to be some of the best stallers. It's a fairly vague category. You can use your own inferences to, fill in what is going to be a staller for this round, but the general good quality you want to go for in a staller is them not being easily nukeable by most of the strong nukes. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean they can't be taked by nukes, but it needs to not be, a super quick fight. For example, Thing can obviously be taken by Tigra and Torch, but it's generally like a 60-second fight for Tigra or Torch instead of their normal absurd speeds. So having someone like Thing, he is still going to be a good staller, even if they have a nuke option like Tigra or Torch or Omega, because he does enough stalling to make them not nuke the fight, of course. And these are the three basic principles of defenders. In general, I like to lean heavily on stallers and using outdrafting in two ways sparingly, and when it really makes sense to use them. Of course, you do want to combine all three strategies in your deck, and you want to have a good mix of all three, but stallers are by far the most reliable. They're almost always going to be effective, so relying more heavily on them is going to, in general, give the best results. And now we're going to talk, mixing in with the ban strategy from the last video, where I mentioned if you're not going to be banning these nukes, then you need good ways of dealing with these nukes, and having defenders that aren't going to be easily taken by nukes. So for me, since I lean heavily on stalling, I ban Hercules, because he kind of gets rid of a lot of these stallers. And I'm leaving, Torch, Tigra, Archangel, CGR, all of these nukes open. And then I'm going to use defenders that do a good job at dealing with these. They don't have to be fantastic at dealing with them, but they need to be good enough at dealing with them. This tends to be like Thing, this tends to be like Toad, like APOC, Korg, Havoc, Rintrah, Nick Fury, of course. And a lot of these defenders that can still be taken by these nukes. But it's to a point where you can beat that opponent, even though they're going to be using a nuke option for your fight. You're going to be able to generally easily outspeed them with these defenders just stalling enough. And if you're not going to be banning nukes, having these stall defenders, these generic stall defenders, is going to be absolutely essential if you're not banning nukes. Otherwise, you're going to get destroyed by a bunch of nukes, of course. And yeah, that's the basic principles of defensive strategy. There is going to be some more that I discuss in draft strategy, with using certain defenders to bait out your opponent's attackers so they won't have them for a future round, and that can let you kind of work around an outdrafting scenario. But we're gonna touch on that more in draft strategy. But just to give a quick rundown of how that works, I did this in the streams sometimes. But let's say, for instance, you have Nick Fury, you've got Mole Man, and you've got Korg as your defenders for one round, and they have an Archangel and an Omega. What you would want to do is, you would place your Mole Man first round, kind of throw this around, and they're gonna either use their Archangel or their Omega for that Mole Man. And if they use Omega for the Mole Man, then you're gonna place Nick Fury. If they use Omega for that Mole Man, then you're gonna place Korg, and Korg's gonna be a decent defender. If they use Archangel for that Mole Man, you're gonna place Nick Fury, and Nick Fury is going to be a decent defender. And there's some like that with throwing rounds, with using these defenders that kind of fall into a similar category to each other that can work really, really well. I'll touch on that more in the drafting strategy, but I wanted to give a little bit of that in this video, just to give a baseline, because that's something that can work extremely well if you have, multiple defenders of kind of the same type. And yeah, take care, guys.